So today I'm going to take a look at what happened in 2025 in Valorant, and we're going to take a look at kind of the main patches that we got and the main updates, and then also taking a look at the VCT calendar, whether I think, that worked as well on terms of the pro side. So let's just dive in, and our first one here is talking about patch 10.0, which the main part of this is what you're looking at on your screen, of course, is Tejo. And Tejo was perhaps the first agent that we'd got in a very, very long time that came out and was kind of busted. This hasn't happened in Valorant a ton. Generally, I think Riot likes to play on the conservative side, and with Tejo, they just got it wrong, and Tejo came out and was, dominant in the meta and became the meta very, very quickly across pretty much every single map. And it was a bit of a problem. Now, to give Riot some credit, as we'll come to later on, I do think that they learned from the problems that they had with Chamber and were quicker to address Tejo in a meaningful way than they were with Chamber, for instance, because when Chamber was the meta, they did a lot of like little bit, I'll change this here, tweaked it there, right, and hope that that would fix Chamber. It didn't. They eventually had to give him a substantial nerf. And with Tejo, I think, they were quicker to that and realizing like a substantial change is needed here. Let's just make it. And it did work, to be fair to them. So that is on their side, but obviously the release of Tejo as he was a mistake. And the next major thing that happened really was Wayle coming out. And Wayle, I think, is more in line with what we are used to seeing with Valorant agents and how they come out, which is, maybe even a little underpowered overall, and then Riot will give them some buffs as people get more used to actually how the agent works. It took a bit longer, I think, with Wayle than it does with most other agents, for people to figure out the proper play pattern with Wayle. But eventually we got there, and, Wayle is in a pretty good spot now. So Wayle, I think, overall has been a success. Okay, next let's talk about patch 10.08. So in this one, they tried to nerf Yoru. You might remember this. This is where they nerfed the Yoru ult. Still, you could argue we're still feeling the effects of this patch because this was their first attempt at nerfing Yoru, and it didn't really do anything. In terms of nerfing Yoru, I think in general they have kind of failed overall because his pick rate from this point, when we're at 10.08, his pick rate, if anything, has gone up since this point despite receiving multiple nerfs. And speaking of that, Tejo nerf actually came in the very next patch, 10.09, where they did hit Tejo pretty hard, and I would say this is probably one of the best things that they did in 2025, right, is recognizing that problem, going for a big nerf. They also decided to just throw in this random breach nerf for some reason, but I will give them more credit for the Tejo stuff rather than the kind of mistake that they made with breach. Okay, then in patch 11.0 we got Corrode coming out. Corrode as a map, I think, is a decent map. I think most people will probably put in the middle of Valorant maps. Let me know if you think Corrode is at the very high or very low of your list of Valorant maps, but I think most people will probably put it somewhere in the middle. And yeah, it's a fine map, and so that's probably better than most of the other maps that they've released, so I guess that's a win. Then moving on to patch 11.06, and this is when we got replays. Now, the replay system in general, I think you can look at in kind of two different ways, right? On the one hand, I think the replay system is technically very, very good, right? It does a very good job in terms of just being a replay system, right? In terms of being nice to use, and actually being a replay system. I think technically it's a very good achievement. However, there is another side to this, and I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow as well, that I feel like the scope of the replay system, again, is a little bit conservative. Personally speaking, from someone like, my perspectives, obviously the replay system for me could have been used if pro VODs were in there, for instance, to help me quite a lot in terms of making content and even just understanding what actually happened. I'm having to guess sometimes. Unfortunately, they decided not to do that, and so I do think that the replay system could have been more than it has ended up being. Veto, and again with Veto, I think the jury is out on Veto in general, and we also got Skirmish as well. And Skirmish, again, I would put into that same category of like the replay system. Like, it's something that people wanted, but again, the implementation of such a thing maybe isn't as good as it could have been, right? Like, if you could go into Skirmish mode whilst you were waiting in queue with your duo queue or whatever and do a skirmish, that would be great. A lot of people would love that, right? Instead, it's just kind of like buried as like something, oh, you can do this if you want to. And then, of course, we got patch 11.08, which we talked about a lot on this channel, but this is the big nerf patch, right, to a lot of agents. Now, in general, again, I've already talked about this on this channel quite a lot, so I'm not going to bore you with the details too much, but obviously, I wasn't a massive fan of the general direction, and I would say that this patch was a failure not because of the direction, because that's subjective to me and how I think I want the game to be. I think that this was a failure because it didn't actually nerf the agents that were already good. Talking about, agents like Viper, agents like Yoru. And then we got the Harbor rework. And again, with the Harbor rework, I would say that this was a failure as well. This just didn't do enough for Harbor. You can argue, is he a little bit better? Is he a little bit worse? Some people might say. Does it really matter when an agent needed probably a fairly significant buff to see decent amount of play, and it's not going to with this rework? Like, yeah, it doesn't matter to me that much. This, I think, was just basically a failure. Okay, so that was the year as a review in terms of patches and things that Valorant added to the game. And I think in general, the things that they added to the game, all fairly good, but could have been better. And there were some, like, I would say fairly big mistakes. On the whole, some good, some bad, probably more bad than really you would hope for. Now let's move on to kind of the VCT calendar start of things, and we'll talk about kickoff first of all, right? So the teams that went to champs got a bye. Right, so that will happen this year as well, that these teams will get a bye, and that's based on last year's results, right, which some people didn't like in kickoff. Of course, we did just have double elim rather than the triple elim that we're going to see this year, which I think that this year they have fixed this, because again, what would happen here is, certain teams would play 2 games, you then wouldn't see them for quite some time. So overall, I think that the changes that they've made to kickoff this year should make it a bit better. And then we had Masters Bangkok, and here's another one for you where it was an 8-team Masters. Thankfully, they have ditched this as well, because I think this is one of the things that I disliked the most about the VCT calendar. This one, I would say, particularly was saved by this game, right? The 3-2 G2, which I still think was the best game in Valorant's history. A 13-5, a 13-9, but then a 13-11, 15-13, 16-14, all the final 3 maps in a full best of 5, decided by 2 rounds. And a lot of crazy moments within this as well, particularly here on Pearl, the final map. A lot of craziness going on. This, I think, is the best game in Valorant's history. This kind of saved Masters Bangkok, I think. Then we came to Masters Toronto, the first 12-team tournament. And 12-team tournaments, by the way, do have problems as well. We have had this kind of weird situation. Is it good to start here, or are you better off, starting in the Swiss? Because, like, again, another Swiss team this year, Paper X won it, and they only just got through the Swiss as well. This, I think, was a tournament that actually, a lot of these games, like if you look at a lot of these games, right, a lot of 2-0s in this playoffs. And I think really Wolves carried this tournament. I know, obviously, I'm saying that, but I do think without Wolves, this tournament would have been not that great. And it did have a good grand final as well between, obviously, 2 very steamed teams, and Paper X winning was, a big story. Then during stage 2, the kind of main thing that happened here, of course, was the fact that we had different rules for champ points in the different regions. So you might remember that if Americas had the same rules as Pacific and EMEA, then Cloud9 would have gone to champs instead of MIBR. Now, with how champs played out, I think I'm glad MIBR went. But should that have ever been the case? I kind of hope it's not this year. I hope they kind of realized that and went, what the hell are we doing? We should have the same tiebreakers for all regions. That should be absolutely the case. And then finally we had Champs, and Champs I think was overall a pretty good tournament and was quite fun. I think we had some, real banger games in there. It was helped by the fact that NRG, for most of their games, they were extremely close, and they were the team that ended up winning it. The grand final was almost the worst grand final of all time, but thankfully Fnatic locked in, or NRG choked, if you see it the other way, and managed to win Abyss, but then ultimately NRG did go on to win the whole thing, and Ethan saved me from having to oil up. So that was the VCT schedule. There is one other thing I want to talk about as well, which is that the 2025 capsule release for the VCT teams was shocking, and I wasn't a fan of it whatsoever. So not a fan of the capsules. Go back to creating everyone having their own player card. It's so much better. I understand it's quite a lot of work, but it's so much better if they have their own. And with the schedule, I think it, every year the schedule improves slightly, right? We got an example of that with the kickoff being triple elim, 12-team Masters instead of an 8-team Masters. And I feel like every year it just gets a little bit better each year. So those were my thoughts on 2025. Let me know what you think kind of the biggest mistake was of 2025, what you're hoping that Riot will do better for 2026. That's what I'll be talking about tomorrow. Some of the things that I want to see happen in Valorant in 2026.